Ukraine's counteroffensive has reached a transition point, not a point of failure, as has been labelled by some of the commentators and media sources. We are 20 months into a war that General Mark Milley said would last 3 days. Russian planners estimated 10 days. A Ukrainian military once considered inferior to Russia's has militarily defeated Russians on every single battlefield in Ukraine. They've killed apparently more than 300,000 Russian soldiers, and according to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, recaptured half the territory that Russia initially seized in its invasion. This does not seem to be a failure. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, do please consider supporting us by becoming a patron or buy me a coffee. Today is going to be a unique episode because we have two fantastic speakers to introduce. That's why I'll have a shortened introduction and then we'll jump into the questions. Jon Sweet is an accomplished intelligence professional who served for 30 years within the defense and intelligence sector as a US Army military intelligence officer. He is now a freelance author, contributor, and columnist for The Hill, The Messenger, Washington Examiner, Kyiv Post, and Fox News. He provides an experienced military perspective on current world events. Mark Toth is a retired economist, historian, and entrepreneur, and has lived in the US diplomatic and military communities around the world. Mark currently writes on issues of national security and foreign policy and is a regular contributor to The Hill, BBC, Washington Examiner, Fox News, Kyiv Post, and The Messenger as well. And we will, of course, be posting links to many of your fantastic articles in the description of the video, but I'd like to welcome you both to the channel.
Thank you for having us today, Jonathan. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Absolutely, absolutely. So delighted to have you both here. There may be a certain amount of chaos as we decide who gets which question. But let's start, I think, with one of the more difficult ones, but one which is very prevalent in the news at the moment. And this is the idea of peace in our time. Why is this a dangerous idea? The idea that it's possible to negotiate with Putin and get an equitable peace.
Just primarily because Putin has a terrible track record of living up to his word, of honoring his word. We've seen that most recently, or maybe not most recently, in the first Chechenian war, which a ceasefire was negotiated in May of 1997, and then less than 3 years later, when Putin became the prime minister, it re-instigated the assault against. He has a terrible history of living up to his word, and that's the principal reason. And quite honest with you, I can't believe that Ukraine believes him. Look at the Budapest memorandum; they had issues with that also. It's the track record.
And Mark, I guess you'd echo that view as well.
Jonathan, I would, and I'd even take it out to a little bit higher altitude. I know a lot of people right now, in looking at the conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, as well as what may be coming in the Indo-Pacific, kind of view this as a multiple choice test. It's not. You don't get to select one or the other or yet another in terms of what the West needs to be addressing. It's all three. They're all combined. And so peace in our time in Ukraine, if we go down that path, which is fool's gold, is really going to impact what the Middle East looks like, what the Indo-Pacific looks like. And we need to keep our picture, our eye on the ball on all of them. And not just isolate just in Ukraine. And so as John and I repeatedly argue in our various articles, it's essential that we look at them all as part of the same ideological war against the West, something we currently have out today in the Daily Mirror in the UK, where we're saying, hey, connect all these dots. It's essential that we do.
And the idea of peace of some sort is also based on the idea that Putin is not just a rational actor. I mean, it may be that he's not that irrational, given his own terms of reference, but that he operates along similar rules that we do. However, his strategy throughout 20 years, and indeed, if you look at something like the sort of book Moscow Rules that's put forward by Keir Giles, escalation is actually at the heart of how Putin operates. So rather than, taking a pause, thinking rationally, coming to an equitable peace, it does seem that he's on a form of escalation autopilot. Do we have a strategy to actually deal with that?
Well, if we do, we haven't seen it yet, and that certainly is the problem. We tend to, from our perspective, we tend to give in more than we push back. At least that's what we're seeing. And when I say by give in, I mean we fall back on words like defend. We fall back on words like support. We fall back on words like we're going to stand beside you for an indefinite period of time, instead of using words that matter, words that we're going to help you win. Okay, win is a key word. Win is what's missing in U.S. policy right now, and quite frankly, it's missing in the NATO doctrine also. But again, NATO's a defensive alliance. I get it, but without win, even if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, the Baltic states and Poland will still feel threatened because Putin has written that his intent is to retake those territories, even though they are NATO territories. So, no, we don't have a policy to counter escalation.
Yeah, I would add also that at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of talk about the Gerasimov escalation doctrine. And I think we've found in practice, however, that there's a lot more PR aspect to that than there has been in reality. And the Biden administration in particular, as well as NATO, has kind of bought into that escalation fear. John and I kind of have coined it escalation paralysis over the, escalation paralysis over the last year and a half, as we've been writing about it, where I think we fear escalation more than what we've actually seen on the battlefield. If you look at the warfare to date, and John can comment a little bit more on this than I can, what we're really seeing is World War II tactics. We're seeing artillery as king. We're seeing encirclement of cities. We're seeing siege tactics. We're not really seeing a lot of escalation. In my view, I think Putin in reality has been more like a pit bull. He's latched on, he's bitten onto Ukraine, but I don't see the escalation yet. Now, having said that, that's Ukraine-centric. The first escalation we might have seen is in the Mideast, and another article that John and I wrote, where we believe that Putin's fingerprints are all over the Hamas attack, via Iran, as well as something that John and I are keeping our eye on in terms of North Korea, the meeting that took place earlier this year between Putin and Kim Jong-un at the spaceport, that was upping the ante there. And John and I assessed that to be a direct signal threat, however you want to interpret it, to the U.S. So right now, no escalation in Ukraine, even though the West fears it and keeps reacting as though that's going to happen. But there is escalation happening in these other kinetic battlefields away from Ukraine. John, your thoughts on that?
So I'll just add one piece to that also. So we do see an escalation in the form of demonstration. By alerting their nuclear force, by withdrawing from nuclear discussions, by threatening to exchange nuclear technologies to Iran and Korea. We see that escalation, and that always weighs in on the Biden administration's decisions that it could go there. But while it hasn't gone there, in the meantime, what we see is just a continued escalation of technology and capability in Ukraine, and the deliberate targeting of civilians with cruise missiles, with the latest in technology from drones from Iran. So we do see an escalation in conventional munitions targeting civilians, but we haven't seen a physical escalation to the nuclear side, other than the threat. And that threat hangs over, as in, I'm going to use this if you don't comply with me. But yet, we don't believe Putin wants to go there. He knows that if he goes there, he loses. So that in itself is telling also.
And it's tricky, isn't it? I guess understanding whether Putin is being an opportunist when it comes to, say, the Middle East, and certainly the trolls reacted incredibly quickly to that. It perhaps suggests some kind of understanding that this was going on, if not direct involvement. But it's difficult throughout, isn't it? If we take something like Brexit and also the election of Trump, it's difficult to know when they may have had a direct hand in moving the dial, or whether they're simply pouring petrol on the flames and leveraging situations to their own benefit. And if we take the Hamas situation. Many buildings across Paris last week, I believe, had anti-Semitic graffiti appearing. There is now a plausible connection between Russian foreign intelligence services and what would look to be an act of domestic hooliganism, which is very unnerving for people. You know, it's creating chaos and fear. But here we're starting to join the dots a little bit.
Yeah, and Mark and I wrote about this in one of our articles also, where we talked about distractions away from Putin's failures in Ukraine. And one of those distractions, obviously, is disinformation. A lot of disinformation circulating, obviously, throughout Moldova, trying to affect the situation there. But disinformation is king, particularly in Africa. Look at what Russia has been able to do in Western Africa, in the Sahel region, with their disinformation campaigns, getting people to turn on one another and against the governments and against their former colonial powers, in this case, France. But other distractions, stirring up ethnic tensions in Kosovo with the Kosovars and the Serbians, targeting pipelines, communication networks in the Baltic Sea, stirring the pot in the with Azerbaijan in that area, and not coming to the support of one of their fellow treaty members. No, it's Putin's like a good defense lawyer. He's throwing everything out there up against the wall, hoping something will stick. And in some cases, it is sticking. It's sticking, obviously, in Israel. There is some stick. We've seen the United Kingdom deploy additional soldiers into Kosovo. So there is some success there. In the disinformation campaign for Russia, particularly with their FSB, they have an upper hand on the West, and the West has to do something to counter it.
Yeah, I think in terms of looking at Putin's connections to what's going on in the Mideast right now, is not to get too caught up in the chicken and the egg process, which came first. I think you hit it on the head. The petrol analogy is apropos. Putin's taking advantage of it. And in the background of all of this, we have to remember is Putin's special military operation, as he calls it, in Ukraine, is faltered, as he's gotten stuck, stalemated, however you want to describe it, on the battlefields there. He's looked to align with other countries. John and I called it Arsenals of Evil, actually, for a London-based publication initially, and looking to Iran, looking to North Korea, because he's expending ammunition at a tremendous rate and can't keep up in terms of a domestic production inside of Russia. And so what we're also seeing, though, is not just Putin aligning to North Korea and Iran. We're seeing Iran wanting to align to Russia. There's mutual benefits going on here. So for me, leave that chicken and egg conversation, just my opinion, on the side, and pay more attention to these, almost like a clash of atoms coming together. And we need to be paying attention to what new, atom that they're going to create by combining. And we're seeing that. And I think with Hamas, well, maybe Putin wasn't exactly aware of the date, the occurrence, et cetera. He understood where his technology was going to. He understood what the funding might be happening to. And Iran certainly did. Nothing, I've lived in Israel. I've been to the Gaza Strip. Nothing in the Gaza Strip happens without Iran knowing about it at this point. And so you have these aligning interests. You've got Iran actively involved in funding and training Hamas. And you're seeing this all come together. I think that's what we need to be cautious about going forward, is whether or not it was started that way. It's what we're seeing now. It's what it's become.
And of course, it's another brittle authoritarian regime. You could apply that label to maybe not so much North Korea, but you've got Syria, Belarus. These are not necessarily regimes that are absolutely assured of their position, and to an extent, they seem to be reliant on each other for mutual support to suppress their peoples. Is that a reasonable sort of understanding of why they're taking these increasingly sort of desperate and risky measures, or do they feel a certain amount of impunity and confidence?
It's a great question. No, they particularly begin first with Belarus. They lean on Belarus because one, they consider Belarus to be part of the Russian Federation. One, but two, their ability to militarily at least, Belarus is similar to Russia. They use the same equipment, they use the same doctrine, they use the same munitions, they go to the same schools. So they have a like source to their immediate left. And Belarus also provides, at least for Russia, a buffer between Poland and Russia. So they're in a position that they provide some support to Russia. And of course, we saw Belarus come into Russia and saying we want nuclear weapons to be stored here. Well, they wanted them to be stored there because they're afraid that they're going to be invaded by Poland, or at least that's the story that they use. I don't think Poland's ever intended to invade them unilaterally or even as a part of NATO. But no, they leverage those capabilities. Same with North Korea. North Korean equipment is very similar to Russian equipment, particularly in the makeup, but in the munitions too, and the tactics. So they can leverage one another. And as Mark said, when we call them arsenals of evil, Russia's been giving for a long time. Now Russia's reaching out and saying, give back. And we've even seen this most recently in a newspaper article, which I thought was very telling earlier in the week, that Russia is turning to some of the countries that they've sold military equipment to, and they're saying, can we have it back? Particularly with Egypt, they're asking for helicopter engines back. So it's just telling where they are right now and what they need and who they're turning to get those goods to continue their operations.
John is absolutely right. I mean, that's one side of the coin. The flip side of the coin of that, though, is we're also seeing Putin suffer in other areas, Moldova, in terms of Armenia. Here you have a CSTO member, Putin's version, watered down, weak version, whatever, milquetoast version of NATO, and yet Putin sided with Azerbaijan over what was happening in the Karabakh, or Nagorno-Karabakh. And so the flip side of that, though, is it's not all green grass on Putin's side of the aisle. I think the people that are aligning with him are the ones that are more like desperados. They have no choice. Belarus is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's economically dependent on Putin, can't turn west, can't turn east. He's just trying to survive. In terms of Iran, same thing. They're in a fight, an existential fight in their minds with Israel, and they've got the U.S. Creating heat on them, most recently in the form of normalizing relations, hopefully, at some point with Saudi Arabia and Israel. And so they're forced to turn to Putin. And then you've got Kim Jong-un, whom I think is just in a class of his own, where he doesn't really want to be beholden to anyone, whether it's China, wants to be able to poke us in the eye as the U.S., but he's also looking at it opportunistically. His country's poor. He needs money. His blackmail campaigns aren't working like they once did with the West. He can't fire enough missiles anymore to exact more ransom payments from us. So I think that's what he's doing it. So there's two sides to that coin. The side that's very dangerous, very kinetic, Iran, North Korea, and what we're seeing in Ukraine, with the potential of Belarus participating in that. But the other side that also represents an opportunity for the West to pull those countries away, the Moldovas, the Armenias, and we are seeing efforts to do that.
And you've also written, interestingly, about the cost. You've written here about 300,000 plus ghosts in Ukraine, and that is the number of troops that Russia has apparently lost, although those figures obviously are estimates. But you've also written about why, despite that huge price, he may not be looking for a ceasefire. And does some of that come out of the weakness you've described, that actually he's gone beyond a certain point where you can't revert back to the political system that was there before, to the hybrid information system, the tolerance of certain points of view? He's created a kind of empire, I think you're right, of puppets, corpses, and ghosts, and hooked himself to this war, this everlasting war. Do you think that there's no going back for him?
I don't think, and I don't see a way for him to go back, just because humiliation, I believe, for him is the ultimate defeat, and he will not accept humiliation. And he is more than prepared to continue sacrificing Russians for his cause. And it's not just Russians, it's foreign fighters, it's mercenaries, it's ethnic Russians. But if you notice, it's not coming from Moscow or St. Petersburg, it's coming from what he considers to be the lesser Russia that are fighting his wars for him. No, he doesn't turn back. And his play right now is outlast the West, because he knows that there is a tolerance. We call it in the West, at least in the United States, the term has been Ukraine fatigue. And we're starting to see Ukraine fatigue because we're not seeing, at least from a military perspective, this huge success in a counteroffensive. But at the same time, they're not being given the tools they need for that success. And when I say those tools, the tools that they need are to establish air superiority, one, and two, to provide fire superiority. They have the tools for maneuver, but when you lack those two big pieces and you lack the ability to interdict, I saw estimates today that maybe as many as 400,000 Russians in the occupied territories of Ukraine. But Ukraine doesn't have the ability to affect their flow in the country because they are limited in their abilities to fire across the border, to interdict those forces and those supplies before they come into Ukraine. So they're forced to fight them in Ukraine, and they're taking heavy casualties because of that. If they could take the deep fight away from Russia while they're fighting the close fight, they could push Russia out of Ukraine, both in Crimea, but also in the Donbass region. And you hear General Hodges talk about this often, to the point that they have to evacuate so you don't have to invade. And untenable means ATACMS, Storm Shadow, Scalp, and if Germany would support the Taurus missile to hit those deep targets, hit those ports, those headquarters, those storage facilities, and where the troops are staging.
Yeah, and I think I'll briefly add to that. The one thing that John and I've noticed, whether the 300,000 number is accurate or not, I've lost track. John and I wrote an article that 300,000 coffins may not be enough for Putin. This was 6-7 months ago. Sometimes these articles start to meld in your mind. We took a lot of heat for that. We're like, you're crazy. It's never going to come to that. And I would say, look, it's not important to get caught up on the whole number, but as an economist or a former economist, look at the trend and what you're seeing trend-wise in terms of battlefield losses, not just in terms of men, but artillery, tanks, all the things that in the past, and John might want to add a little bit to this, all the things in the past that Russia has defined, Kremlin has defined as the strength, the core of their army, their doctrinal approach to warfare, all of those things are being attrited at an alarming rate. And so from that standpoint, John and I are more focused on looking at it from sorry, John froze there for a minute, making sure I still had you guys. We're looking at it more from the overall effect on the battlefield. And it's suggested that Putin may not yet be getting a complete picture. I'm not so sure he knows what exactly is going on in the battlefield. People may be afraid to be giving him bad news, or maybe he knows and just doesn't care, or maybe it's a combination of that. So it's a little bit difficult to assess from the inside, just because there are times when we hear these reports that, shot down 1,000 planes on a day. I'm exaggerating, but they remind you of World War II kind of reporting that was, overly optimistic and never proven out, in the after battle reports that were released after the war. So to answer your question, though, I concur with John. He's going to keep pouring people in, whether or not it's because he realizes he's losing or he doesn't realize he's losing. At the end of the day, I don't think he cares. He's that pit bull. He's going to keep biting at it until he thinks he finally kills Ukraine.
And Mark,
let's stop.
And I'll just, because Mark opened a segue there for me. Artillery and personnel, those are the two capabilities that Russia masses. That's what they have. Artillery is the bedrock of their military. Heavy volumes of artillery followed by infantry. They can generate the numbers. They're going to continue to generate numbers of people that they can put into Ukraine. Estimates, I believe, from yesterday said that there's still another 40,000 troops, Russian troops now, that are still trying to take part in the encirclement of Dika. 40,000. And just in a month, the 4 weeks from October to November, they lost, maybe not necessarily on that battlefield, but within Ukraine, the Russian soldiers, 24,000 Russian soldiers were killed in that 4 week period. But yet they can generate another 40,000 to throw into the fight. But mass doesn't win wars anymore. Mass is, and we learned this in World War I with the machine gun, and the Russians are learning this in this war with cluster munitions. Technology wins over mass. And we're seeing that right now, which is why it's so imperative that that flow of munitions continues to go into Ukraine so they can continue to attrit. But attrit at the main defensive battles won, and I'm going to harp on this again, but if you can't attrit the interdiction fight, you're never going to get in front of it. You're always going to be react. And right now, the policy that the United States and NATO are using are forcing Ukraine to react.
So let me add to that. You know, I would also add that something that General Hodges, former U.S. Army Commander Europe, says often. It's also about introducing capabilities onto the battlefield that Ukraine needs, which is what John is getting at. You know, the DCIPMs, the cluster munitions that allowed it. Right now, there is a qualitative advantage that the West has if only they would use it, apply it. But we're not seeing that yet, at least at a level that General Hodges assesses is needed. And so what Putin can do in return right now is throw soldiers, but 40,000 men sounds like a lot, but how qualified are they? How trained are they? How old are they? Are they young guys? Are they old guys? In my mind, and I believe in John's, and he can speak to this, you're throwing fodder. He knows what it's like to lead men into battle. And you're leading people into battle that have no clue what to do. It really is back to Stalingrad. Pick up that fallen rifle, find a bullet, and shoot. That's not how you fight modern warfare.
And the trend line, if we look at the trend line from Russia is not necessarily going down as fast as we want in terms of they're still getting volumes of ammunition potentially from North Korea and so on. They're getting volumes of men, albeit poorly trained. What does that trend line look on the Ukrainian side? Because of course they will be taking terrible losses given the proportion of their population. But is the trend line there towards more accurate munitions, drones, precision, and what are the different trends that are going on in terms of Ukrainian capabilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a finite resource level that Ukraine can pull from. I just read that of the 30,000 soldiers have now been trained by the UK Army to fight in Ukraine. I don't know if that's just recently or that's from start to finish. They've trained upwards to 30,000, but a huge commitment has been made by the United Kingdom to train them. Same with Spain and other countries as far as individual training. The technology, though, and we've talked about this with the drones, the Switchblade drones, the Javelin shoulder-fire missile systems, the ATACMS delivered DPICMs, the cruise missiles. Those technologies that are affording the warfare to change. And Mark and I wrote an article about this almost 18 months ago, talking about the revolution in military warfare, revolution in military affairs, and how the battlefield has changed, how the tank, the once dominant tank that ruled the battlefield now is not as dominant as it once was. It can be defeated by a $9,000 missile, or it can be defeated now by a $600 drone. The T-72s you see repeatedly on YouTube or on whatever social media platform you're watching. You're watching these full motion videos of drones going into those systems and exploding. The battlefield has changed. Technology is changing that battlefield, and it's aiding Ukraine. But with technology comes a cost, and right now that cost comes both in Ukrainian lives, but also in dollar bills and in euros. And that is where many people on the home front are saying, hey, we have problems here too. And that's where this Ukraine fatigue is starting to set in. And of course, it doesn't help that other issues are flaring up also. But technology wins this war. And you have to keep feeding them. One other point, I just want to make one other point, and I harp on this in a lot of the articles that we write about defense. We continue to say defend. NATO says defend, the United States says defend, and we are pouring air defense assets into Ukraine. And that is incredible because these systems, the NASMs, the Patriots are doing incredible jobs defending Ukraine. But that's all they're doing is defending Ukraine. It's a war of attrition between the Patriot missile and that cruise missile. Okay, and we can shoot them down all day. Some are going to get through. What we're missing is if you defeat the platform that launches the missile, that platform can't launch the missile the next day. Okay, so yes, defense, but at some point there's got to be an active defense in which you're targeting those assets that are targeting you and taking them off the battlefield, and then reducing your reliance upon that so you can actually maneuver and fight that close fight and that deep fight.
You know, I would also add to John's point that, you know, the West has got to quickly value the life of a Ukrainian soldier more. We're asking him to fight in ways that the West would not do. Ukraine's doing a great job of doing a multi-domain campaign, taking the war to Russia. In some instances, the drone attacks that we've seen in Moscow, the deep strikes into Crimea, and some deep strikes into nearby Russian air bases along the border. But we don't yet value that soldier enough to protect them. And I think better ways to do that, the technology to get to your question that you're asking, is Israel can be informative here. You know, early on, you know, one of the questions that we had, John and I talked about privately, was how would Israel respond to what was being learned by Hamas on the battlefields in Ukraine? And you're not seeing Israeli tanks being taken out at the same level. So we know that those, you know, anti-electronic warfare capabilities are out there, and it's a question of how do we channel those into at a greater rate into the battlefields, into Ukraine, because we are reading where Russia is becoming more effective with its own drone attacks on Ukrainian positions. So this is a little bit of an area that I think John can speak better to. So I'm going to punt right now, but I think he can talk better to that point of lessons learned in Israel need to be applied immediately to get to what General Hodges says, those capabilities applied to Ukraine.
No, and Mark hits the nail on the head. Again, it's being more offensive. It's not sitting back and waiting. It's taking the fight to the Russians. If you sit back and wait for the Russians to attack you, they have the initiative. And what you see right now in Israel is Israelis aren't waiting for Hamas to come after them. They're not even waiting for a Hezbollah to fire at them. They're going after them. They're actively targeting them, and they're making contact. They're not waiting. They're not playing for the tie. They're not trying to defend. They're trying to throw somebody out of Gaza, just like Ukraine wants to evict Russia from Ukraine and from Crimea. And those are, I mean, those are the lessons. I think these are the lessons that we've forgotten. I mean, General Patton, I mean, and we fall back. You'll see a lot of quotes in our articles about General Patton, but General Patton's famous for saying, nobody ever won a war defending anything. And he's right. I mean, if you sit there and wait, you lose the advantage. You have all this technology behind you, but you're waiting for someone to attack you, wave after wave after wave. And there, in some cases, there's been 50 to 100 assaults in a 2-day period. And the Ukrainian military, that soldier is sitting in a foxhole, has got to be wondering, when does it end? It's psychological too. I mean, it's psychological on both sides, but it never ends. Okay, you don't see progress. Offense gives you progress, and look at what Israel has done. They have proceeded to encircle northern Gaza, while at the same time holding off Hezbollah to the north and opening humanitarian corridors and getting people out so they can continue the close fight. The close fight's the most brutal part of this, but if you take out that second line of defense and that third line of defense, when you get past that main defensive line, you don't fight another main defensive line because everyone's out of those defensive positions and now they're moving. Russia does not fight maneuver warfare well. They want static targets. They want static targets in the offense, and they want static targets in the defense. And Ukraine can outmaneuver them. Ukraine has Leopards, Challengers, and soon to be, and we haven't seen it on the battlefield yet, but the M1A1 Bradleys. Not Bradleys, I'm sorry, the tanks, M1A1 tanks. Support it with Bradleys, don't get me wrong, it's a combined arm offensive. But they have the tools to outmaneuver them, and they have the artillery punch to set the conditions to outmaneuver them.
And that leads to a very, I think, interesting question, because yes, there is fatigue, and that's a factor of time, and the sheer weight of news stories, media impatience, and so on. But it does seem that there is a strategic decision, or dare I even say flaw, that goes right back to the start of the full-scale war, and that is to equip Ukraine defensively, not to win decisively. And then a lot of people have been perhaps saying, well, it's due to a whole range of things, the political complexities, the difficulty of getting stuff to where it needs to be, getting financial approvals, et cetera, et cetera. Is it now perhaps far more apparent this slow walking or dribble of capability is strategic rather than accidental?
We've called this strategy in a number of our writings the just enough strategy, just enough that Ukraine can defend itself. And look, that strategy worked wonders for the first 4 months of the war, from March to July. That strategy worked, and it saved Ukraine. They were able to defend themselves, prevent the Russians from getting to Kyiv. And then when we introduced this system called the HIMARS, it fundamentally changed the outcome of the war, because now it gave Ukraine an offensive punch, and Ukraine was fighting back and pushing the Russians back. Only when Ukraine had to stop and wait for training and wait for equipment and wait for personnel were the Russians able to dig their defensive positions, reinforce those positions with men, put in these obstacles, these trenches, these tank barriers, to put in their defensive that would provide those front lines. Only when Ukraine stopped did that occur. We have failed to transition the Ukrainian military out of the defense into the counteroffensive. We failed to set the conditions for them to allow them to push. In that time gap, that 3 or 4 month time gap that it took, it set Ukraine back. And what we're seeing now, and we talked about this earlier, on 9 October, when Russia did their counterattack into the Donetsk Oblast in October, that forced Ukraine, who had the initiative, who had the momentum, who were pushing the Russians south to the Sea of Azov and back into Crimea. They had to stop, and then they had to reallocate and reposition forces to address that counterattack. And they did, and they fundamentally stopped it and destroyed a large number of Russian forces. But now they have to reset again, because they depleted their ammunition stores. They took a number of casualties, and as they wait to reset, Russia resets. Those third line defenses are the first line defenses, and they're going to have momentum, and they have to regain momentum, which means they're going to have to get additional artillery, armor, and hopefully the F-16s will be introduced and other fighter aircraft to provide that air superiority for the December, January, February fight, the winter fight.
Jonathan, I think if I understand your question correctly, and it's a fair question, a good question, while there probably is somewhere on a Machiavellian level, someone that calculated, their calculus was, let's bleed Russia, let's Ukraine. We've certainly seen that out there in the media and the political circles and the like. John, in my assessment, and I make sure John agrees in a minute here, John's, in my assessment, really, though, it's been a fear of escalation. I don't think the White House itself, I don't think Biden is sitting there, I'm going to bleed, I'm going to weaken Russia at the expense of Ukraine. I think he fears, probably arguably Jake Sullivan has planted this notion in his mind that if he escalates the war, it's going to get bigger, could turn nuclear, all the things John and I say, hey, when? We're already 300,000 dead, or at least a trend line that's suggestive that's going to be occurring soon. And he's not escalated. He's not going to escalate. Petraeus early on, General Petraeus, another General John, I had the honor to work with extensively in Iraq, said it early on that the consequences to Putin going nuclear, whether it's tactical or otherwise, would be huge. And Putin knows that. He's not going to take it nuclear. When you hear Russian media, and John and I follow them all the time, we found ourselves mentioned by Pravda and TASS, Sputnik, from time to time, You're good at this. You lived in Russia, Jonathan, so you know. It's strange to be Googling your name in Russian, but we see it pop up in times. They use the nuclear threat as a teddy bear for their own domestic public. That's like, all is well here, nothing to fear, nothing's going to get that bad. Never mind that the sons of many Russian mothers are dying, but everything's going to be okay in the end. So while I think, yes, to just circle back, put an exclamation mark on your question, I do believe on some levels there's some Machiavellian types in the Pentagon saying, yeah, great, we're getting that effect, but I don't think that's driving the policy. I think it's more, at least John and I assess it, it's more Biden fearing what the consequences will be. And our argument is he should stop. Well, we're in complete alignment with your comments at the beginning that Russia needs to decisively lose this war in the most humiliating of ways. This can't be setting ourselves up for a rinse and repeat if somehow Putin wins. And who knows who's next? Poland, Moldova, you pick it.
That's right. And it seems, and according to your latest article, that we're at a pivot point where key decisions need to be taken, and with a degree of rapidity, not strung out over many, many months. So in your view, what needs to change to ensure this war turns from being relatively, not static, but attritional, and one based on taking out logistics and attriting those supply lines, but turning it back into a war of movement where Ukraine will have the advantage over Russia? What needs to happen in terms of decision making, but also supply of munitions, coordination between allies, and so on?
First is just the commitment to win, and I can't stress that enough. It has to be said out loud. The president has to say it. The Prime Minister of United Kingdom has to say it. It has to be said out loud so the Russians understand Ukraine's going to win and we're going to back them. Then the tools need to be delivered to help them win. And when I say tools, I mean precision deep strike capability, air superiority, the munitions that they need, the artillery pieces, the tanks. That's got to come in. It can't come in 6 months from now. It has to start flowing now. And that's, you know, one of the arguments we make is that those decisions are just dragged out, and because there's always something. It's logistics. It's always going to be logistics. But, you know, the Ukrainians have figured out a way brilliantly to make everything work and make intended. And they've also shown this incredible ability and innovativeness to use those weapon systems in ways that the West hadn't considered before and be successful. So the thought is, if Ukraine says we need this, instead of cherry picking them and saying, well, why are you doing that? You should be doing this. Why don't we say, what do you need to win? I mean, intelligence, obviously, we're going to give them the intelligence that they need for targeting purposes, to track movements of Russian forces. But they really do need those precision deep strike weapon capabilities, and they need artillery, and they need, when you maneuver, you got to have tanks, you got to have Bradleys. But more importantly, all that doesn't matter if you can't breach the obstacles. So if you don't have the engineering assets to breach the minefields, to breach the trench lines, and to get through quickly, because you can't afford to get stuck in there. If you get stuck in there, Russian artillery comes on top of you. And we've seen through videos what Russian artillery is capable of doing. But more importantly, we've seen what Ukrainian artillery is capable of doing in Russian formations. You see columns stop because they hit the first tank, and then they just hit each successive tank afterwards until they're all gone. And that's the way it is. It has to be combined arms warfare. They have to have superiority in air, in fires, and in maneuvers. And it has to be enabled through engineering assets and intelligence. So it's not easy. I mean, it sounds as though, oh, yeah, that's real easy. We can just put this together. No, it's not. But Ukraine's been fighting this war for 20 months now. There's still a lot of experience, both in the staff and at the battlefield level, in which they can implement that. And they can go faster, but they need the tools. And right now, they simply don't have the tools they need.
Yeah, I'd put an exclamation mark on that to say it's all about capabilities. And we're 20 months in. There's no excuses anymore for why things couldn't have been in the pipeline. And right now, we've taken up to date a clear the shelf approach, clear the cupboard, get rid of the old stuff. Let's not give them the best stuff. I'm the son and grandson of fighter pilots, and air superiority is key. It's key to U.S. military doctrine, NATO doctrine, and Ukraine doesn't have that yet. They can't go far into the deep battlefield and control it. And unfortunately, the F-16s are getting these A and B variants. They're midlife updates. They can't compete as well as they need to against similar Russian equipment. So this notion that suddenly with Ukraine getting these F-16s, just as one example of the kind of capability they need, this isn't going to be Iraq. You're not going to see Ukraine I hope we do, but I doubt it. You're not going to see Ukrainian F-16s flying deep into Russian controlled airspace because they don't have the DAD-C8 capabilities to come with them. And so in terms of looking at that, the West can't just keep clearing the cupboard. They have to do what General Hodges is stressing. Think about the capabilities they need. And in my mind, admittedly, John's an Army guy. I come from an Air Force family. We've got to help Ukraine catch up in the air because they're badly behind, and it makes no sense. Combined arms warfare does not work without an air component, and yet that's exactly what we're asking Ukraine to do.
And another aspect, and we've focused mainly on the regular battlefield, but Ukraine has also shown it's adept at certain irregular tactics, as led by Budanov, with the Free Russian forces in Belgorod, the drone attacks on Moscow, and a variety of other things. And of course, now there is the story of targeted assassinations of collaborators with the Russian regime and indeed Russian officers. Now, without making any sort of judgment on that, do you think that Ukraine needs to be allowed not just to sort of strike deeply using conventional arms, but it needs to be able to run some of these alternative strategies to destabilize the situation within Russia itself and distract Russia in the way that Russia is using the Middle East as a distraction for us?
So the short answer is yes. And Mark mentioned this term earlier, multi-domain operations. And that's exactly what you just described. It's the close fight, it's the deep fight, it's the interdiction fight, it's the fight of partisans behind Russian lines. It's the fight of special forces operators operating deep within Russian lines. It's the utilization of their subsurface drones, of their deep strike drones, of their deep strike capabilities with the cruise missiles. It's all those things together. That ability to put a drone into downtown Moscow to hit the Kremlin the way they did, that's messaging. And it sends a message to the Russian citizen that, everything that we're being told on TV, but I just saw a drone fly over my head. Multi-domain operations, it keeps Russia off balance. When you can't keep them off balance, you give them the opportunities to mass and attack. You have to continue to do that. And I love the reference you make to the anti-Putin forces and how those forces are being leveraged and attacking cross-border. That has a psychological impact on the Russian citizen that lives in those areas, but also when it gets into the news, and it does on Telegram, it does get out there and people do see it. It has an impact. But all those things together keep Russia off balance. And it's hard for them to focus on. And they were very successful at that upwards till October, when we had the Hamas attack and then the counterattack Donetsk inward, and to focus on one spot on the battlefield, and they lost sight on everything else.
Yeah, I concur completely with John. I would only add something that John and I have gone crazy with over the last 20 months of this war is we don't understand this concept of why Russia is allowed to have sanctuary, why the rules of warfare have suddenly changed, where Russia is given all these advantages by NATO, by the West. You can't do this. Our weapons can't attack there. World War II never would have been won had we put those kind of conditions on the Soviets. Here's Lend-Lease, Churchill, but you can't do this, you can't do that. That's not how warfare works. And so this notion that somehow Russia is deserving of sanctuary, given all the depravity that we've seen inside of Ukraine, the raping of women and children, the war crimes, the intentional targeting of civilian facilities, going after food sources, going after the electrical grid so that they can try and weaponize winter. Russia doesn't deserve sanctuary, and there's no reason in terms of being able to fight warfare that we should be affording that. And yet, in too many instances, we are. Madness.
And the last question there, and this is maybe an extension of what you said there. Should we be far more bullish in making Ukraine an integrated part of the Western Security Alliance? So that is a fast track to NATO, bringing the unoccupied territories into an umbrella or protection of NATO. Dare I say it, even putting troops and creating sort of protected air zones for those parts of the country that Russia doesn't occupy, and essentially saying, well, you're not going to come any further than this. I know that was discussed at the start of the war and dismissed, but is now the time to be more bullish and push Russia back?
Let me step in here real quick because I want to give John the last word. Let me say emphatically yes, with possible exception of having to think a little bit more about the air cover side of it. But it is time to go all in, and I don't mean nuclear. I'm talking about conventional forces, but it is time to get more bullish. And John can, and in terms of Ukraine has already fought its way into NATO. It should already have had its accession point, and it's not. So that all needs to happen. And John can explain the military reasons better than I can for why it's essential that Ukraine is part of NATO as quickly as possible. So with that, John, go for it.
No, I agree. One of the talking points that came out of Vilnius during the last NATO summit is if we bring Ukraine into NATO now, since war against Russia, that we would have to fight Russia as an alliance, which is one of the reasons why there was a lot of pushback. But I think you have to declare publicly, you have to make it known to Russia that there is a pathway. And Ukraine needs to understand this too. There's a pathway. And that pathway is 6 months, 12 months, however it is. But there is a definable pathway, an achievable pathway that they're going to get into NATO. And they're going to get into the EU. And Russia just has to, they're not going to accept it. They're not going to want to accept it, but they have to know that's coming. You can't turn your back on these guys after you've strung them out for 20 months. And Mark and I talk about this a lot. If Ukraine were to fail, if Russia were to somehow defeat Ukraine or come to some type of negotiated solution, whether there's a line drawn that says east of this is Russia, west of this is Ukraine, it affords Russia, and we talked about this in your very first question, time to reset, time to rearm, time to refit. And I got to tell you, I can't believe countries like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Finland are going to wait for Russia to reset. They're just not. You don't wait till they come to their strength. You attack when they're at their weakest. So it could, by doing something like that, it could actually spawn a war, because the Poles are not going to be subverted again by Russia. They're not going to be occupied again. Hungary may want to, but Poland does not. And the Baltic states certainly don't. I've worked with all those countries. They have no desire at all to be brought in underneath the Russian umbrella again. And I'm not saying that they will, but what I am saying is that they're not going to sit back and wait for Russia to regain its strength when they know Putin has written that they're the end state. So I think there's more danger in not supporting Ukraine today. And we're not saying invade Russia. What we're saying is give Ukraine what it needs to push the Russians out. Then you have this clear border of this is Ukraine and this is Russia. Then you bring Ukraine in. Then you talk about maybe NATO forces going into those particular areas to provide additional defenses. But, you know, it's a complicated, it's a hard solution. And if it was easy, we'd have already come to it by now. And I get that too, but it's not going to be won by defending anything. I mean, Patton said it best. You're not going to win anything by defending. It's attack, attack, attack. Russia only understands a bloody nose. They don't understand negotiations.
That's a very strong, powerful statement, I think, to end on. And it also brings the conversation nicely full circle with where we started. Mark and John, it's a huge, huge pleasure to speak to you. And of course, to read your excellent articles that have really been pushing for this far more decisive strategy throughout the full-scale war. Good luck with future endeavors there. Thank you so much for spending time and sharing your insights with the audience.
Hey, thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And the opportunity to come on. Yep.